Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Bitkom Privacy Conference. I hope you enjoyed a nice lunch break, and I'm very glad that you decided to join me on the main stage yet again. I'm joined by someone who has attended last year also, and I'm very glad, Miriam, that you are back here with us. For all of you who don't know her yet, I will introduce her very shortly, and I do hope that you remember maybe the talk and the issues we had discussed here last year, because Miriam Wimmer is the director of the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, and as Brazil has developed a great new data protection framework, we gave that new framework some space for discussion last year already, and I'm always trying to build up a continued dialogue with all of the data protection experts around the globe, and that's why it's so amazing, Miriam, that we can basically continue the discussion we had last year. So thank you, first of all, for taking the time.
Thank you so much for inviting me again, Rebecca. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the opportunity of sharing some updates on what's going on in Brazil.
That's very, very great. Maybe to get our discussion started, would you share with us maybe the most recent developments? What has been done since we talked last year? How is the data protection framework developing? And in general, how has your work maybe changed at the Data Protection Authority? To give us an overview.
Of course, Rebecca, I'd love to share some information. And in fact, I think it's important to note right at the beginning that this is still a very new topic in Brazil. So we have a general data protection law that was approved in 2018, in August 2018. This law then had a grace period before it entered into force. It entered into force in September 2020, and then our National Data Protection Authority was created only in November 2020. So we are at this point less than 2 years old. And it's indeed been a very interesting challenge to begin creating these foundations, from the ground up for data protection culture in Brazil. In Brazil, we didn't previously have laws dealing specifically with data protection. We had a number of sector-specific rules for consumer protection, for instance, or in regulated sectors such as telecommunications, healthcare. But the introduction of a comprehensive data protection law was in fact something very new for us, very exciting. And so there is this huge challenge of interpreting this law that is, of course, very cross-cutting, and understanding how it deals and interacts with other sector-specific rules or with other general laws, such as our Consumer Protection Code. So I think, catching up from what we were discussing last year, we have in fact made lots of progress. And I'd say that perhaps the most important highlight here is that Brazil actually amended its constitution in February this year. And now we have a new autonomous fundamental right of personal data protection. This is something important because previously our constitution would mention rights such as privacy, the right to intimacy. We had the habeas data, which is a procedural mechanism to enable citizens to have access to public databases. But there was not yet the recognition of an autonomous fundamental right of data protection that goes beyond privacy, that involves not only personal or intimate or secret data, but also data that flows across our public sphere. And this, I think, was a very important achievement because it also, I think, highlights the importance that data protection is gaining now in Brazil. And all this was, of course, accompanied by the maturing, the improvement of ANPD structure. ANPD is our National Data Protection Authority, Autoridade Nacional de Proteção de Dados. So we were created initially as a very small body connected directly to the presidency of the Republic. When ANPD was created, in fact, there were only 5 members, the 5 directors in a meeting room. And now we are indeed quite in a better position because we have approximately 80 staff members with different backgrounds. And I think also perhaps one of the most important recent evolutions is that we have recently had a provisional measure with force of law that gives us full independence. And I think this is in fact very important because when you look at the best practices internationally, it's clear that an independent DPA is very important to ensure that there is competency and responsibility and independence in monitoring both the public sector, but also the private sector. So this, I think, is an important development that also enables us to perhaps take more important steps in terms of enabling international data transfers, for instance, and interacting with our peers in other countries and in Europe, of course. So what is ANPD doing at this point in time? I think it's important to mention that we have a broad range of responsibilities and competencies. So we have a rulemaking responsibility, so we can enact rules, guidelines. We have also the responsibility of handling complaints. And this is something that we have done a lot over the past 2 years. I think as people gradually become to be more aware of the existence of a DPA, also they begin to complain more, which is natural. We have the responsibility of monitoring data processors, carrying out audits, applying sanctions. Also, of course, the role of education, capacity building, of setting technical standards, and also of dealing with international data transfers, which I think is an important aspect because unlike Europe, where you have the European Commission approving adequacy decisions and SCCs and so on, in Brazil, it is the DPA who is responsible for carrying out all these activities, approving standard contractual clauses, BCRs, also assessing the adequacy of other countries for the purposes of international data transfer. So it's quite a complex role of responsibilities. And as I mentioned, we now have approximately 80 staff members. These people come from different areas of public administration, so they have different backgrounds, both technical, economic, legal, and they also have experiences in different bodies of the Brazilian public administration. So some of these people come from regulatory agencies, as is my case. I worked previously in our national telecom regulator. Some of them come from consumer protection, some of them come from antitrust, some of them have a very technical background. And I think this has been very important to enable us to have a broader perspective of the impacts of the work we are doing and of the rules that we are now issuing. I think also a point that is interesting to mention is that we have a very transparent and participative mechanism for rulemaking. So we are required by law to have public consultations, public hearings, also to carry out regulatory impact assessments before issuing laws. And I think rules, and I think this has been very interesting to see how we have a growing level of engagement in Brazil on our activities. Just to give an example, Rebecca, our recent consultation on the application of administrative sanctions had over 2,000 contributions. So I think this is quite expressive, and I think it shows how there is, a growing awareness of personal data protection in Brazil, and also increasing attention as to what the DPA is in fact doing. So I'd like to focus on some of the more important developments within ANPD, some of the more recent work we've been doing. And in fact, I think perhaps one of the main focuses of interest now is the issue of administrative sanctions, right? So everyone is very curious to know when ANPD will begin sanctioning, applying fines, if we will be very heavy-handed or have a more light touch approach. And in fact, it's important to note that in Brazil, although our law was approved in 2018, it had a grace period also for sanctions. So administrative sanctions only became applicable. The law only entered into force on this aspect in August 2021, so a bit over a year ago. And the idea was that during this period, organizations would have the time to adapt, to understand what the rules were and what they should be doing in terms of compliance. So last year, we approved our first regulation on the procedures for applying administrative sanctions and also administrative monitoring and enforcement of the law. And I think it's important to note that our choice at that point was to adopt a responsive approach. So instead of going through the traditional command and control approach, which basically means I set the rules and if you disobey them, you will be fined, we decide to have a more step-by-step approach, visualizing that, especially in a country where this is still a new issue, it's important to have different stages of incentivizing enforcement that do not necessarily involve immediately the application of fines or other administrative sanctions. So we have different procedures. First, we begin with monitoring the market, receiving complaints, and then we can identify what the main issues are. when we have specific incidents that are under our examination, many times we will issue warnings or provide deadlines for the company to comply, to reorient their activities in order to be in compliance with the law. And then we go moving up to administrative sanctions, which can range from simple warnings until the determination of suspending data processing activities. So this was approved last year. And now at this point in time, we are going through a public consultation. We've just recently concluded a public consultation on the criteria for applying administrative fines, administrative sanctions more concretely. So in which cases will we consider that a certain infraction to the law is a light infraction or a medium or a heavy violation of the law, and which sort of sanctions will we apply depending on the concrete circumstances of each case. So this is what recently went through public consultation with over 2,000 contributions, and we're working hard to have this regulation approved still this year so that we can in fact begin effectively applying sanctions when this is necessary. Another recent development is that we also approved the regulation for providing for specific rules for SMEs and smaller organizations. And I think this is important because especially in a country like Brazil, a continental country, a huge country with a very heterogeneous market, we have small organizations, large organizations, and in fact, our law states that it is important to have a sort of asymmetric regulation taking into account the characteristics and the nature of the organization as well as the risks involved in the data processing activities concretely. So we issued regulation providing for simplified rules for small organizations that do not carry out high-risk data processing activities. And I think this is important also because initially we had this moment of panic where everyone was very worried that, companies would have to spend lots and lots of money on data protection. And in fact, when we created these asymmetric rules, considering the nature of the activities and also the size of the organization, I think this was important to show that there are different ways of complying with the law, different ways of promoting the protection of data subjects' rights, and that, of course, the rules have to be proportionate to the risk of the activities that are being carried out. And also, we have issued guidance on a number of different issues. So we very initially, at the very beginning, we issued guidance on the concept of data controllers, data processors, and the role of the DPO. There was initially lots of confusion in Brazil on these concepts because, unlike Europe, these concepts are new for us. So lots of strange interpretations of the law, and we tried to clarify this point. Then we issued issued guidance on data protection in the public sector. And of course, there are many specificities. This is an issue that has also been examined by our Supreme Court, establishing some limits to data sharing in the public sector. And so we also try to help clarify this point. We also have a guide on data processing and elections. And as some of you may know, we are currently in the process of general elections in Brazil, presidential elections, elections for governors. And I think as we move towards increasingly data-driven elections, it's important also to take into consideration what is legitimate and what is not legitimate in terms of the use of personal data in this context. We have also issued guidance on information security, on the use of data for research purposes. We very recently published documents on the use of personal data of children and teenagers. And at this point, we're working on a number of different issues, but I'd like to highlight, just to conclude, Rebecca, that one of the most important issues on our table at this point is the issue of international data transfers. So we also just recently went through a process for a request for comments, where we drew up around 20 different questions, broad questions in order to enable us to understand what the main issues are and how we should approach them. This consultation was also very successful. We received a large number of comments, and we were also able to engage with colleagues in other jurisdictions, with public and private organizations working both domestically and internationally. And I think the main message at this point is that we are going to begin by focusing on standard contractual clauses, which I think are a more simple mechanism, an off-the-shelf mechanism to enable data transfers. And of course, as we work on this issue, we are paying very close attention to what is going on in other parts of the world, in Europe, in the UK, in Singapore, in Colombia, in New Zealand. And I think our effort at this point is to figure out what our challenges are in Brazil and what is the best way to approach this issue in order to allow data to be protected no matter where it is located. So I think I'd like to stop at this point, Rebecca. Maybe we can move on to a Q&A, and I'd be happy to take any questions or respond to any doubts you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this great overview. I definitely have the impression that a lot has been happening since we last spoke, and it has only been a year, which is kind of amazing. Especially that you mentioned that you introduced the data protection right into your constitution. I bet that it wasn't easy to do that. Normally, constitutional changes take quite a lot of time and effort. So I think it's a great step. I remember that Commissioner Reinders, because he had the introductory keynote this morning, and he specifically mentioned all the changes that are ongoing in the data protection framework in Brazil. Could you maybe tell us a bit more what those changes are about? So was he only talking about the changes on the DPA side? So what you have been doing, or the guidelines you have published, or are there any regulatory changes yet to come?
Thank you for the question, Rebecca. And I'm really glad to note that there is, global attention to what is going on in Brazil. And I very keenly feel the responsibility of the work we are doing, because in fact, I think we are a very large country, and I think there is a huge impact when we try to regulate an issue that affects 213 million inhabitants, with consequences not only domestically, but also internationally. So I didn't actually see Commissioner Reinders' remarks, but I think there are many different aspects of many consequences of the work we are doing. So perhaps it's important to note also that in Brazil, while we were discussing the introduction of our general data protection law and then the amendment to our constitution, there were different issues on the table that sort of guided our reflections and our work in this theme. So, of course, one aspect is the recognition that personal data, is a projection of the human personality, and therefore it needs to be protected. Data subjects need to have rights. They need to have informational self-determination. So, of course, this is one very important aspect. And I think huge progress has been made by the introduction of the law and by the constitutional amendment. But on the other side, I think also an important part of our discussion was the economic aspects of data processing activities. And I think as all countries move towards an increasingly digital economy, as we go through this process of digital transformation, it's important also to understand and figure out and create an environment where data can flow through different environments and across different economies in a manner that respects data subjects' expectations, but also that allows the data to be used in a responsible manner to promote societal well-being. So I think that when we look at these two aspects, and when we look at the LGPD, our General Data Protection Law, it's clear that there was an important attempt to try and build these approaches into each other and build bridges between these different aspects. And so I think that when the commissioner mentions the work that is going on and the regulatory developments, I think he may be referring to both of these aspects. And of course, I would highlight the issue of international data transfers as something that is very central to our global digital economy. And in fact, we have, as I mentioned, we have very recently gone through consultation processes involving SCCs, for instance. And I think that the job we have right now is to figure out what is the best approach for Brazil, because our reality is not the same as Europe. It's not identical. We don't have 50 years of discussion in courts and in authorities on what, in fact, data protection is and what the conditions are for international data flows. This is a new topic for us. Also, we have strong commercial relationships with Europe, but also with the USA and with countries in Asia. So I think our challenge right now is to figure out what the best approach is, if we should have perhaps a more prescriptive, a more rigid approach towards international data transfers based on models such as the European SCCs, or if we should look to more flexible models and explore other mechanisms such as certifications, for instance, which I think is still something of an unfulfilled promise also in the GDPR. So we have been discussing with colleagues in other countries, also with colleagues in the European Commission, and I have the feeling that as we move forward on this agenda, there will be the opportunity to have, I think, more legal certainty, both with regards to the protection of data subjects, which I think is a core issue, especially since we have a fundamental right in this regard, but also to promote better economic cooperation, economic exchanges that naturally will involve the flow of personal data across different jurisdictions.
What I also found very interesting, Miriam, was when you talked about how you try to find proportionality, especially when it comes to sanctioning and having a step-by-step approach, also regarding the requirements for companies, because that is something that we are still trying to embed into the data protection framework in Europe as well. So I think that greatly shows how the developments of data protection, even though it is so new on your end, it really mirrors what has been done in other regions of the world. So I would always wish for a steady dialogue between you and the EU politicians and DPAs as well, to try to bring the two instruments as close together as possible, because as you mentioned rightly so, international data transfers are essential for the globalized economy, and having a secure and of course data protection friendly data flow between the continents is absolutely essential also in the future. What I also found absolutely amazing was that you mentioned you had 80 members of staff in the DPA, and that they come from very different backgrounds. So it seems to be quite interdisciplinary. What I was thinking about just now is, because in the European data protection framework, there's a lot of exchange going on between the data protection authorities. We have quite a lot of them. So we have 18 in Germany, which is quite a lot in itself, and then the 27 other DPAs in the European group. And they are exchanging knowledge and guidance, of course, quite regularly. Is there some similar kind of exchange happening in South America or with the US DPAs?
Yes, of course, Rebecca. And I think, especially for us, we have to have a position of humility, of, having our feet on the ground and understanding that we are at the very early stages of a learning curve. And if we can learn from the errors and the successes of other authorities, of course, this will make our work much easier. So when we began, getting set up and organizing our structure, we initially began establishing cooperation agreements with other bodies within Brazil. And of course, Brazil has a complex institutional framework with over 800 consumer protection organizations acting locally, with independent public prosecutors, with regulatory agencies in different fields. So initially we began a strong dialogue with these organizations. But then we also wish to learn from colleagues in other countries. And this involves, of course, multilateral organizations. So for example, Brazil joined the Global Privacy Assembly, the Global Privacy Enforcement Network. We are observers to Convention 108, but also establishing bilateral relations. So we in fact have a memorandum of agreement with the Spanish Data Protection Authority. We have a strong informal cooperation with the European Commission. And here in Latin America, we are members of the Ibero-American Network of Data Protection Authorities, Rede Ibero-Americana de Protección de Datos, which is a very interesting forum for us to exchange experiences, perhaps something like the EDP-BIP, something similar perhaps, so we can get together and exchange experiences. And besides that, we also have bilateral relationships going on. So for instance, very recently, the Mexican DPA visited us in our headquarters. We also very recently had meetings with the Colombian DPA to discuss international data transfers. And I feel that, as a Latin American country, it is very important for us to be aware of what is going on in the region and the different approaches that exist, because we already have some countries who are considered adequate by the European Commission, others with different approaches. So also understanding if there is sort of a regional standard that could emerge is something that is, I think, super important for us at this stage.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, there are already a few companies also in South America who are who have a adequacy agreement, and I, for my part, would very much hope that we will see that for Brazil in the future as well, because we have always made the experience that international data transfers are, of course, made possible easiest if there is an adequacy agreement. And from what I've heard from you today, I really think you have made great progress. It seems to be a quite functioning framework already, which I think is really astonishing, seeing that we did have like decades of discussion on data protection before we have the GDPR. It's our 5th year now already. It entered into force in 2018, so and we're still discussing so many things. I really get the feeling you're doing a better job. We'll definitely have to learn from you. What I would also find very interesting to hear, Miriam, is a bit more about your daily work at the Data Protection Authority, because you also mentioned data subject rights, and that it's quite a new fundamental right as well. Maybe we'll start with that. What is the most relevant topic in your everyday work life? What comes up most often? What is the most common question?
I think that's a really great question, Rebecca, because in fact, there is a disconnect in a sense between what the DPA may see as a priority for the country, and what data subjects perceive as priorities for themselves. So here we are discussing global data transfers and harmonization, interoperability. At the same time, data subjects are concerned about unwanted phone calls, for instance. I actually yesterday consulted our ombudsperson and asked her what the main complaints are, and she came up with a list of 3 topics that are on our day-to-day life on the table that data subjects access and request information or request some sort of action on. The first one is data sharing between different companies. So often a data subject is the consumer of, for instance, a telecom provider, and then another telecom company calls them and said, I know you are a customer of so-and-so and you pay that much amount, and I have a better proposal for you. And then customers ask, well, how did you get my personal data? How is this possible? So that's an important issue. And I think it's also perhaps made more serious by the fact that we had important data breaches in Brazil. So in fact, many people have been victims of fraud or this kind of unwanted approach, which I think is very serious and should be taken, in a very serious manner. A second important point that is always the object of complaints is unwanted phone calls. I'm not sure if this happens also in other countries or in Germany, but in Brazil, you may be constantly accessed on your cell phone, on your home phone, at 8 o'clock in the morning, at 10 o'clock in the evening. People call you, they offer you different products. And in fact, this is something that creates lots of inconvenience. And often data subjects will call the DPA and say, listen, what can you do about this? I don't want to have any more phone calls. And this, of course, is something that transcends data protection. It involves also consumer relations and so on. But it's certainly something that reaches us very often. And the third point that is often brought to us before our formal complaints channels is the issue of companies asking data subjects for certain kinds of personal data that are perhaps unnecessary or too invasive. So often when a customer goes to a drugstore, the drugstore will say, listen, if you want to have a discount, you need to give me your taxpayer's number so that I can check up on who you are. And sometimes this is actually presented as a condition towards buying certain products. And this creates, of course, lots of discomfort. It's a practice that is certainly, I think, not very adherent to what the law says. So this is something that is the object of complaints. Sometimes people wish to buy services online, and then the company says, well, send me a picture of yourself holding your ID card. And this is something that customers are also not very happy about. So as you can see, these are very day-to-day issues. They are complaints that relate to, daily activities, and they have to be taken very seriously by us. So I think the challenge is also that at the same time, we are looking at very large strategic issues, but also very day-to-day issues that affect the life of data subjects in a very concrete manner. And those are perhaps, I think, the main topics on our table at this point in time.
That's very interesting to hear. Especially because I bet there will be additional regulation about at least some of these issues especially regarding unwanted phone calls. For Europe, there has been there's been regulation against that for many years, because I agree absolutely with you. It can be a real nuisance, and I think it's always important that companies are allowed to call their customers or other people who are not yet customers but agreed that they will be interested in hearing more about, I don't know, services or other offers or products. But I wouldn't want to be called at 8 o'clock in the morning by someone I don't know and I have no interest in their product. So I think there will be additional changes soon. I bet there will be. Miriam, we already ran out of time. I would have a lot of other questions as well. Let's do that next year, hopefully, at the latest. Thanks again, and really thank you so much for giving us a glimpse of all the developments that have been going on. And it's always great to hear your perspective on things as well, because as I said before, I think we can all learn from each other and be better at building a functioning data protection framework globally if we look at all the different approaches that have been developed over the last couple of years. So thanks really for your time today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for the opportunity. Have a nice day.
Thanks. For you too. Bye-bye.